because ultimately the ref is fundamentally about people, despite the decoupling of researchers and outputs. Ref is made by the people that work in institutions, whether those be academics or professional services. So for me, HR is really fundamental to all of those discussions about ref and the ref work, but it is often a hidden part of the ref machinery.
Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of What the Ref, our attempt at demystifying the world's favourite research excellence framework. I'm Ola.
And I'm James. And this week, I guess we're going to do a little bit of a digest from the ref announcement on the 10th of December, but we're going to hold over a proper discussion of that till later in the new year, because we have a special interview today, right? So Ola was at the kind of the launch of the final version of what the ref is going to be, or at least what we're now told is the final version. And you did an emergency pod with Simon in the venue, wasn't it, right?
That's right. We sneaked out and looked for a quiet room, and we actually bumped into another journalist there. So we had a little fight over the room. But in the end, we managed to record the emergency podcast and, give you just a few snippets of the news. But I think as the reaction has been unrolling and we've had the time to digest the reports and the guidance, we're probably going to come back to you sometime in the new year with a proper analysis of what all those new things mean.
My sense is that there's a lot of relief in the sector. People are just pleased to have certainty. I guess we've seen a lot of views flying around. I've seen some stuff around like the pressure institutions around their kind of institutional level narrative statements, what that's going to mean. There's been concern over some levels of community engagement, some stuff on outputs as ever, but lots to pick up on, and lots of discourse, and that's kind of good in a way, I think, because it's good that people are talking about this, and good that people are talking about the kind of the disappearance of the word culture, what that might mean, and whether or not it's pertinent or not. But yeah, it's something that we'll come back to later.
Yeah, and it will be interesting to read and listen to various voices within the research ecosystem and what they have to say about that change. So it would be very nice to, over Christmas, maybe over a bit of turkey and roast potatoes, look at those reports and the articles that come and connect with you again in the new year.
And I guess with these things, like sometimes it does take a bit of a rest in your brain to kind of settle before you really have that insight you really need onto something.
Definitely. But I think a great relief that there isn't a dramatic, drastic change that we've all been kind of speculating around. So there's nothing as bad as that, I don't think.
So should we get into the interview?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah,
so this week we've got Sophie Crouchman, who joined us shortly before, I think, the ref announcement in the end. But yeah, Sophie Crouchman being interviewed by Simon Hetrick, who many of you will be familiar with from this podcast. So we'll hand over to Simon and Sophie.
Maybe before we do that, we should just briefly, because I didn't know what UHR was.
Oh yeah, sorry. I totally forgot to say who Sophie was or where she was from.
No worries, I'll do that. So Sophie Crouchman is the Strategic Project and Research Manager at the university's Human Resources. And it's a member organization which brings together around 150 different higher education institutions with over 5,500 members. So it's a really big organization. And I was delighted to hear about them. And I'm so glad that Simon found Sophie or Sophie found Simon. I don't know which way it happened. But it really goes to show that there's so many different roles within the system that we're constantly learning about their input into the ref. So UHR is a kind of touch point. That's what they say on their website. It's a touch point in a complex sector for HR professionals to share their resources and good practice and to support colleagues through various challenges. And university challenges are definitely very unique to industry or broader kind of business challenges. So it's really fantastic to have Sophie. And I think maybe without further ado, we'll let Simon and Sophie now come forward.
Hi, Sophie. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Hi, Simon. It's nice to be here. Thanks for asking me.
So it's really interesting for me. We bumped into each other at the Festival of Hidden Ref, and we had a bit of a chat, and I found out that you're from UHR, and I was just really interested in what the role is of HR in the ref, and I wonder if you could explain a bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So HR has got a really important role to play in ref, and I see that reflected in the members that we work with. So I kind of see it as different aspects. So there's the technical aspects of the ref. So thinking about things like the HESA staff record and data and analytics. We have members who work in that area, and not just the HESA staff record, but things like identifying early career researchers and determining significant responsibility for research in the last ref. So you have HR colleagues who are involved in that kind of work. And then we have members who work in diversity and inclusion. And so they might be involved in, for example, running equality impact assessments, just generally. But obviously that was part of the REF Code of Practice last time around. And other work that they might do feeds into other parts of the REF submission, like environment statements, and also linked really closely to institutional and research culture. And then there are colleagues within the HR teams who work with other professional services on things like research assessment and how that might feed into, for example, reward or promotion criteria within universities. And then obviously, when you think of HR, some of the kind of fundamental HR tasks come to mind around recruiting staff, retaining staff, and rewarding staff. And they also obviously feed into the REF, because ultimately the REF is fundamentally about people, despite the decoupling of researchers and outputs. REF is made by the people that work in institutions, whether those be academics or professional services. So for me, HR is really fundamental to all of those discussions about REF and the REF work, but it is often a hidden part of the REF machinery in universities. And that is a shame, because where things are working really well in universities in terms of REF preparations, HR colleagues are involved. So that happens in a lot of institutions, but it doesn't happen in all institutions.
So possibly naively, I was kind of seeing HR's role at being at one of those points where you discussed, which is the way that the REF drives culture within the universities, and actually how that culture changes and then gets sort of crystallized into policies. It feels like HR is obviously at the coalface right there. And I think especially around promotion, I've always thought that we kind of were working with the REF because it gets a lot of interest, and it gets people excited and interested and agitated. But what we want to do is we want to change promotion criteria, because that's the thing that changes the sort of the sustainability of positions and the recognition of people within universities. So do you do a lot of work in that area, and do you support your HR colleagues in translating what happens in the REF into local policies?
Yeah, so I think obviously, as you've identified, HR colleagues have a really key role in developing those kind of policies. And I think what we've seen at UHR is a lot of our members have done a huge amount of work on this and continue to do a lot of work in that space around, as you say, promotion and reward of academic staff and developing those policies. And I think that's why it's really important for HR colleagues to have that understanding of the REF and how it intersects with things like promotion and reward. And it's not seen as something that's separate, but it's a fundamental part of what universities do. And in my experience at UHR and working with our members, they have a keen interest in REF and understanding what it's all about. They hear it talked about, but I think what is fair to say is that HR is a career path where you can work in lots of different types of sectors. So there will be people who are working in HE who haven't always worked in HE. And if you come in from another sector, there's all the acronyms that you have to get to grips with, but REF is a big one. And that there really isn't anything comparable to that in another sector to make it easier to understand. So that's why we feel at UHR it's really important to bring people together, to share good practice, to talk about policy development. We've got a couple of member networks that reflect that. So there's one around policy, and there's one specifically for colleagues who work in REF, research culture and research assessment. And they have hundreds of members across those networks. And they are really a tool for us to be able to, as I say, bring people together, to talk to one another, to help each other develop policies that are inclusive, but that also link to these the drivers such as REF that we see in the sector.
So I do get the feel that even myself, and I've gone from the position of really knowing nothing about the REF only a handful of years ago to being quite into the REF. But I feel even I've not really sort of noticed how important HR and HR personnel are to the REF process. Do you think maybe we need to do more to get them to get that role understood? And are there ways that you at UHR are working to do that?
Yeah, so I agree with you. I think it is a very hidden role. I think that probably in the last REF exercise, that role of HR practitioners came to the fore a little bit more than it had done previously. For example, in developing code of practice, identifying significant responsibility, running equality impact assessments, those kind of things. And what we really want to do at UHR is highlight that work, and so people can learn from that. So as I say, there is a lot of really good practice. I talk to members who say, yes, we are involved in the REF groups in our university. We're there at the start. We've got a seat at the table. We are involved in those discussions and policy decisions, but that isn't the same at every single university. And so by bringing people together and championing their work, we're able to encourage others to see and value the research that the work that HR colleagues do in this area. It's something that I'm really passionate about, and it's a huge privilege of mine to be able to work with our members and form this network that I mentioned previously for REF, research culture and research assessment. So when I started working at UHR, I had this idea about setting up this network. And so we created it. We created a team site, as is the same for all our networks. We meet usually every quarter. And I was thinking, will anybody actually join this? Will it just be me there on my own talking about REF? But actually, it's been hugely popular. And the other thing that's been really great about it is that we've been able to get people to come along and talk about the work that they're doing, and a really broad section of people. So not necessarily HR colleagues, but colleagues from other professional services. And that plays into the education piece, which is another aspect of what we do, because there are colleagues that work in HR, as I said previously, who they don't know about the REF. They don't know what it is, why it's important, why it impacts on different areas of their work, and they want to know. So that's part of what we do as well, alongside bringing people together. We can give them information, we can give them case studies and good practice examples, and then they can take those back to their own organisations and make that change, no matter how big they are. I mean, we have a huge number, over 150 institutions in our membership, and some of them are massive and some of them are really, really small. So it's important for us to think about the different ways in which they work and what we can do to best support them.
That is interesting, isn't it? REF, a massive exercise, significant amounts of money associated with it. It's obviously very important to lots of people across academia, but actually the level of understanding of what it is and how it works is not particularly high. So with HR, I think a lot of people will associate you with some of the more controversial parts, possibly. Things like the move into the use of HESA data for the volume calculations, and also something that's of particularly close importance to the hidden REF is the recognition of people, regardless of what contracts they happen to be on. I was wondering, how do you support your members when it comes to questions around that, such as, and specifically, the change to allow any staff members' outputs to be submitted to the REF, regardless of whether they're on an academic contract or not?
So that's an area where we can really leverage our networks and as a membership organisation, we can talk to members directly. So we can bring these changes to people's attention. So one way we do that is really simple. We have a weekly newsletter. We talk about all different kinds of things in that weekly newsletter. We can tell people about policy changes. We can direct people to external resources, webinars, and other things like that. We can run them ourselves. We can put on one-off webinars. We can leverage our networks that I've mentioned previously. So we can do a lot of the work around getting information out to people. We at UHR, we're a really, really small team. There's only 7 of us. So a lot of what we do is around that signposting, but also, as I mentioned previously, about bringing people together. So if we do have questions from members, there's various different ways in which they can contact other members without us necessarily needing to be involved. And then we can identify topics that are really important to people. And then within our own networks, we can then find people to come and speak or present or provide information. And because that's another part of what we do at UHR. So we have our own networks. We've built relationships with other sector organisations like JISC, like Research England, to be able to work with them on some of the challenges that HR colleagues are facing. And that's something that we are trying to do more and more of, because we realise that some of these things are really complex. And it is of so much more benefit if, for example, we can ask colleagues from JISC to come to a webinar and talk about changes to the HESA staff record to hundreds of our members. That's a lot more effective for them than trying to go out and talk to each institution individually. And the other benefit of that is that you've got a group of people all together at that time who then can share information and questions. So that's the way in which we try and do things. As a small team at UHR, we do try and help people in that way.
As somebody who runs a small team with a national agenda, I completely understand that feeling. You have to try and scale all of your activities. So this
absolutely.
So this idea of this sort of filter and funneling effect, where you can have JISC come and all of your members can talk to them at once. I guess that works in both directions. So you could also collect your members' views on REF policies that maybe didn't work so well this time, and perhaps nudge the REF sort of guidelines in the right direction for the following REF. Is that something that you have a role in as well?
Yes, absolutely. And I think sometimes it can be quite tricky for HR colleagues to be involved in those kind of national policy discussions relating to REF, because they may not feel confident in their roles to be able to do that. And I think it's fair to say that most of the members that I've spoken to who are involved in REF, it is not a primary part of their role. It's rare that you will find someone in an HR team whose time is taken up with REF for the majority of their role. It will be part of their role. It will be part of lots of people's roles, probably. And so because of all the other things that they're doing, it can be quite challenging to be involved in those kind of discussions. But as you say, we are in a really good position to be able to get that feedback from our members, collate it, and then translate that into either consultations or in that advocacy that we want to do more of in terms of sector organisations. So yes, it absolutely is a filter, and it works both ways.
So I guess on that front, is there anything you're thinking about now that would be changes you'd like to see made in the future? Are you holding on to those ideas until the end of the REF pause? Do you have a list of things you'd like to see?
So I think the REF pause has been really interesting. I think
I agree.
Very, very diplomatic. So I think for our members, one of the things that is top of their agenda is the aspect, the PC aspects, because obviously, as I mentioned previously, HR has a huge role to play in institutional culture, and research culture is part of it, the institutional culture. And they also increasingly are becoming a lot more, I guess, data savvy, for want of a better phrase. And institutions are getting more interested in their staff data and what that says about them in lots of different aspects. So I think colleagues in HR teams just really want to know what the next exercise is going to look like and what that means for them, whether that be the data that they are collating at the moment, or they might need to collect, because institutions do collect a lot of data about their staff for lots of different reasons. Obviously, we have the HESA staff record, which I could talk about forever, but there are other data needs. So I think, they're thinking about, well, what aspects of the data we collect already is going to be important for the next ref. Are there things that we're going to have to start collecting from staff, and how are we going to explain that to staff, and how are we going to get that data, and who's going to deal with it? I think the other thing that's very much on people's minds is that there is a huge amount going on in this sector at the moment. I think it would be remiss of us not to acknowledge that in some way. And HR teams are often at the very heart of that in terms of that change and that transformation. Sometimes the nuts and bolts of it, sometimes what we might call the softer aspects of it around that kind of cultural change, although they're actually not soft when you're at the coalface. So one of the big issues for our members at the moment is workload. And so things like the ref pause create some uncertainty around what that workload is going to look like in future. And I think from a very practical perspective, something that we're hearing a lot of is workload is high. Well-being of colleagues is important, because working in HR can be tough. And just getting that clarity on what's coming next, and hoping that there's not going to be lots and lots of changes that come at short notice, that impact on HR teams. I mean, obviously, they impact much more wider than that, but our members are HR colleagues, so I can only speak for them. Right. But I think those are the things that are really on people's minds at the moment.
So understanding those changes, I guess, especially in the way that the sector is currently, and the financial problems we're having must be exacerbating the issues you have over things like ref rules changing and increasing the workload in that case as well.
Absolutely.
So I guess when the workload changes in that sense, I mean, can you adapt quickly? Is HR always feels like it's more sort of following policies, and if those policies change at last minute, it must be very difficult to pivot. So if they have invested a lot of time, for example, in putting together the structures for collecting their information for the PCE, and then suddenly that disappears, how do your HR staff and members sort of react to those changes?
I think this goes back to what I was saying before about that working together with other professional services. I think it's really, really important that HR are part of the conversation, the wider conversations, because that means that they get support from other colleagues as well. So when these things do happen, they're not left to manage those on their own. They get support from colleagues in other professional services, whether that be, research offices, planning offices, however that it's structured within institutions. I know it's different depending on where you are. I think that, in fairness, HR colleagues are quite well prepared to adapt. I mean, I don't know how much you know about the employment rights bill that's ping-ponging through Parliament at the moment, but it seems like every other day. No, you don't need to know about it. And I'm not an HR practitioner, as it were, because I don't work in an institution. But policy changes are part of HR bread and butter, really. And at the moment, there's a huge number of changes happening. As I say, it could be a weekly basis. There's legal judgments in, all kinds of different areas that impact on HR. So I'm not saying that, they would like it. They would like to see lots of different policy changes coming at them all the time, but they are people who are used to working in that space and used to working with a degree of uncertainty. As you say, I think there can be a perception that it's very much, rules driven, yes or no. But HR colleagues are very used to working in that grey area because when they're dealing with casework or whether they're dealing with, like, say, policy development, there often is a lot of grey area that you do have to navigate before you can get to that final policy. So I think that working together and working collaboratively across institutions is the way in which HR colleagues can be supported to react to the changes that we may see.
It's interesting, isn't it? Every single time you sort of delve into the work of a new group of people that you may have not understood as, and certainly this is the case for me with HR, and worked with HR for a long time, but you rarely learn much about their actual working practices. But you always identify a similar set of problems with, recognition with workload and as you see with other academic roles. And it makes me think that, we have the REF and the TEF and the KEF now. And so, but none of these things really look at professional services. So how do we how do we recognize the contribution of professional services, and how do we do that on a national basis so that we can understand which universities are getting it right and which ones could, do with some improvement?
So I think there's kind of two aspects to this. So there's that piece around internal recognition and reward, and thinking about how institutional policies that you have intersect with people feeling recognised and rewarded in their roles. And again, HR colleagues are really at the centre of that in terms of that recognition and reward piece. And there's a lot of good work going on. Some of that is driven by those internal factors. And then there's some which is being driven by external drivers. So I'm sure you know about the In-Frame project at the University of Scotland, which is about recognising contributions to research. And so there's been some really good work done as part of that around really simple ways to recognise individuals and nominating colleagues who contribute in different ways, and just fostering a sense of people working together. And again, that kind of collaborative voice, which often can really help identify colleagues in professional services who might not be recognised in other ways. And then the other aspect, I suppose, when I'm thinking about that recognition and reward is, so an example of this is that UHR has an awards every single year. We present awards to colleagues who are doing good work. And I know that other membership institutions like ARMA and HESPA do the same. And I think that can be really valuable because it gives, for two reasons. So it gives colleagues in HR teams, in the example of the UHR awards, an opportunity to talk about things that they have done which have made a real difference. And a lot of our members say just actually doing that reflective piece is value in itself, because we're all so busy. We've talked about workload, and it gets talked about a lot in terms of the HE sector. We're all so busy that sometimes just sitting down and thinking about something that you've done and what impact that has had can be so, so powerful. And then obviously you can be put forward for an award. And if you're successful in our case, or you're a runner-up, then we showcase that work through a series of webinars. And so again, that goes back to the sharing good practice. And I think, so that's great that we're doing that. But I suppose neither of those two things that I've talked about is particularly well joined up across the sector. And I think a lot of the things that we talk about in the sector, we can identify those pockets of really good practice and we can showcase them and we can try and bring people together. But ultimately they are happening, independently. Things like one thing we haven't mentioned is technicians' commitment. There's a lot of good work going on around staff networks. So all these things are happening individually. And I'm not sure, this is my personal opinion, I'm not sure in HE whether we've cracked kind of bringing those together. And so as a sector, we have that recognition. I think, like I've said, there's those pockets of really good practice, but how we bring that together as a sector, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the answer is to that.
I don't have an affiliation in the same way that you do. I think, no, I can agree with you that the higher education sector is not good at bringing these different endeavours together so that they can work collectively. Certainly, we found out with the Hidden Ref when we started lobbying. We're not meant to call it lobbying. I can't remember what it said, but basically lobbying. And we're meant to be talking about trying to get recognition for different roles. And we found all of these organisations, and they're our supporter organisations, and we've got more than 30 of them now. They're all making the same arguments, but for particular disciplines or for particular roles, and actually working across them and sort of coordinating and that sort of argument has been really effective for us. And you kind of many of these organisations I hadn't heard about because I was just in the wrong field and sort of siloed, basically, as you always seem to end up in higher education. So I guess UHR has that role, but for HR personnel or departments within universities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's definitely, we already work with other sector organisations. We're really fortunate that we're part of a wider organisation which brings together a number of different membership organisations so we can work together. And we do that regularly. But we are very aware that we are not the only membership organisations or sector organisations out there. And as I mentioned previously, we are definitely trying to build those links with other sector organisations. But yeah, siloed is exactly the right word, because it is challenging. And I think the other thing that we need to recognise is that where people get involved in UHR or whatever their membership organisation might be, they are doing that in time that they, would otherwise spend working. And so we really are grateful to our members for all they put in. So if you come to a network meeting and present on a fantastic piece of work that you've been doing at your organisation, that's great. But obviously in that hour that you've spent there, you could have been doing something else. So we rely very much on our members being generous enough with their time to get involved. And we hope that they get something back. And that's what they tell us, that they get something back by being involved. But as I say, we are very much in their debt effectively, because we do ask them to contribute to these things. And we hope that they get a lot out. We think that they get a lot out of it. That's what they tell us. But it's very much a relationship between us and them.
So I'm happy that you didn't suggest having a professional services evaluation framework, because I think we've got enough frameworks. But actually, if I was to promote one, I think it would be a collaborative evaluation framework. Some way that we recognise people who are actually working outside of their disciplines or their schools or their whatever it is, their universities, and actually sharing best practices and helping in exactly the way that you're talking about your members doing. Because I think that is the key thing that we don't incentivise within academia. Certainly, we don't incentivize it enough. I have to also say, I think you're the only person I've ever talked to in my entire professional life who said that they get very excited at the HESA data.
So this is a bit of a, everybody says that to me, and whenever I present on anything, and I always manage to get a little reference to the HESA staff record in there, and I say, show of hands if you're a fan of the HESA staff record, and I can't say there's a huge amount of hands go up, although I have had a few, but yeah, I do like to talk about it.
It's I've used it myself in my research, and it is really useful to get that insight into the staffing and like demographics and things like that within universities. I think.
Yeah, no, sorry to interrupt you. It's the only record that we have of staff in the higher education sector, and the higher education sector is huge, and it's so diverse, and given the amount of information that we hold, I think it's hugely valuable, not just as a benchmarking tool, but actually for colleagues within institutions to use as a data set.
Yeah, and really useful as a research data set for understanding, the biases and prejudices that could be happening with research because of the demographics and the diversity of staff and things. So I think I spent a lot of time looking at that data when we were looking into the way that software use varied across universities. So I can't help but say it, but I think there's space for a sister podcast in What the HESA. That would work very, very well, I think.
Oh my gosh, don't tempt me. I'd be all over that.
So I just want to say a huge thank you for coming to talk to us and about the role of UHR and the way that HR staff and personnel work with REF. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Simon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So that was great. It's really lovely to have Sophie on the podcast to explain all of her work. What stuck out for you, Ola?
Well, again, it's this hidden role. That's just another role within the system that we're learning about, and actually how much work goes behind the scenes to prepare the entire institution for such a huge, colossal exercise that the REF is. And what's kind of stuck with me is the fact that from the old work days of personnel management that you had maybe in the 80s and in the 90s, and especially at UK universities where maybe there was not really a clearly defined HR function, certainly not HR, but maybe just personal management function that would hire, fire, look after your annual leave and sickness and that kind of thing. So this evolution from personal management into something much more strategic. So suddenly having HR as a partner in making critical strategic decisions around the institution's aims and objectives. And I think what's interesting is now that the REF is explicitly asking for strategy as part of what was PCE now as the SPRE statement. So it's very nice to see that is brought into there and that there's a link with people. So I think that Sophie and the wider, her UHR colleagues and members are going to feel that perhaps there's a light in a tunnel when it comes to being recognized as those strategic partners at the higher level of HEIs. What do you think?
I guess I hadn't quite considered the extent to which HR is central to kind of institutional delivery of the REF. I guess I'd always kind of known that, colleagues in professional services in various roles are really important to delivery, but I hadn't quite put those two together. And Sophie's great at kind of, I guess, advocating for recognizing the importance of those roles. And that, not only are people joining HR and then being asked to deliver the REF, but they're joining HR departments, universities, often having no experience of universities. And I guess, again, that's something we can forget when we sit in kind of more academic positions, that we're kind of situated for a long period of time in a university culture, both nationally, internationally. But actually, many colleagues who work in things like HR functions will come from other HR functions, other businesses, and they're fantastic. But then they have to learn all the stupid jargon that we have. So hopefully things like What the REF are actually quite useful for colleagues in HR settings and try and demystify some of what that is. But it's kind of a double job, right? It's delivering it, but also trying to figure out the whole what on earth this thing is in the first place. Yeah, really interesting in that sense. I was also really interested just to pick up on where we started thinking about the REF pause and the end of the pause is something that Sophie did say is that and she used the phrase research culture. Research culture is clearly a paradigm embedded in HEIs, and that for HR professionals, they're kind of part of their function is making that kind of research culture part of universities possible and underpinning evidence in relation to it. So it's interesting to note, I guess, that if the overarching structures around research is being assessed, maybe moving away from phrases like research culture. But Sophie's saying, well, it's so embedded in universities that I'm guessing that means it will take a bit of time to unpick it over time. But really interesting. And again, that sense that HR is just at the center of so much of making REF happen was not something that I was fully cognizant of. right?
No, but it's interesting you've picked up on the research culture element, because I think the HR professionals generally are much better versed and comfortable with the idea of that, because it directly links to institutional culture and organizational culture. And this is really where it all started, through organizational culture. And I think maybe they understand it much better than for instance, academics who feel that, well, this is something that's not necessarily measurable, and how are we fair around this quite a vague, abstract concept. And I think that HR can bring a lot of expertise and experience in developing positive, nurturing cultures in organizations, and therefore, trickling down to something quite specific as research culture. So I think they play an incredibly critical role, and absolutely they're not, one, they're hidden, and secondly, they're not really recognized for that on the much more kind of systemic level, because Sophie did mention things like internal recognition or a bit of external recognition, but that nothing is really quite coordinated. So there's still a lot of work to be done around that coordination.
Maybe we'll see plenty of people in HR groups being nominated for the next Hidden Ref competition.
Absolutely. Yes.
Just one final thing before we go. I think I was going to say that, like, one of the things I'm often aware of in higher education is that there can be a platitude in institutional strategies around the idea of that we are people-centered universities, or whatever that might be. And of course, we have to be, because people drive the delivery of whatever we do at a university, and then people are the principal people we interact with who come to university as things like students and stuff, or members of the public. But it was really interesting to hear kind of Sophie talk about the way in which kind of ref is about people and HR is about people. And so those things really intersect in nice ways. And you mentioned, rewarded recognition internally. It's HR professionals who ultimately drive things like promotion processes, things like internal recognition processes, and trying to ensure that those things are structured around guidelines that people can understand, rather than kind of vibes. People should get promoted based on the guidelines, for example, not based on things that people broadly just have decided arbitrarily, and in a particular area should be an area of recognition. So I think that's really interesting, that kind of interleaving ultimately of, ref's about people, HR is about people, then HR is kind of central, again, to go back to the point, to ref.
And also, I was thinking, this whole piece around specialization, HEI is becoming, leveraging what they're really good at and building on the expertise. And I wonder to what extent HR will be really needed to, one, identify the human capital for that to happen really in practice, to identify these people, to maintain people so they don't go to another competing university, to scale up that specialization and expertise. So I think they are maybe entering an even more demanding period if you look back and look ahead, and they might be more needed than ever. And
that's kind of interesting, actually, because like when you hear, and we're kind of getting away from, I guess, the topic of the ref, but the ref is sort of, we've set up this whole piece of work because we believe the ref really does drive a lot of cultural change. But one thing that's kind of interesting there is the idea that when people often talk about like universities and changing the university sector and maybe things like mergers, for example, there's this phrase often you hear about like back office functions, right? The kind of integration or simplification or merging of back office functions. And I always assume that like people assume HR is basically, quote, a back office function. But I think
they're
what we
the
hear
bad guys, aren't they, as well?
Yeah. And like what we hear from Sophie is actually like, well, yeah. And from what you were just saying as well, Ola, like there's a sense that, well, you need a knowledge of your organization to do HR well. So to become a kind of amorphous blob of back office functions that support the human resources needs of like 3, 4, 5 HEIs at the same time is not going to kind of deliver the needs of an organization, I think.
But it's been delightful to have Sophie on the podcast. And I also think that gives us an idea into trying to develop some kind of community engagement from different roles, not just HR professionals, but technicians and, software engineers, etc., to maybe connect with us in how they could be better recognized in the ref. What can we do? I'm not just talking about internal recognition or even external one, but how can we embed these hidden roles in the ref properly.
Yeah. Amen to
for
that.
all.
So thanks, Ola. Thanks, Simon. And thanks, Sophie, for that interview. And thanks again to all of you for listening to another episode of What the Ref. We're trying to keep a kind of semi-regular kind of flow at the moment. I have a bunch of ideas for new episodes coming up, but we're always keen to hear more stuff. So if you have things you want us to talk about, please let us know on one of our social channels. And if you want us to interview anybody else, anyone thinks would be a great interviewee, also let us know there. You can put comments on YouTube, or you can email us up at wtref@hidden-ref.org. And we look forward to you joining us next time.
Thanks. You.
Bye-bye.
Bye.